Welcome back. We're still forging Little Monkey Hands of Death. It's taken 8 days, and we're now to step 8 on my handout, Little Monkey Hands of Death with the new improved Super Groove, page 2. And I forged it under the power hammer to match the thickness of the eye, the rain here to match the thickness of the eye, to draw it so that it's wide on edge and then narrow on the flat, and then perpendicular to that is narrow and wide. And what it does is it mimics the old blacksmith journeyman test. Journeyman would show up at a blacksmith shop, and as part of the tradition, the blacksmith would welcome the journeyman to work with the blacksmith for free. The blacksmith had to pay room and had to feed him, but there were some tests that the journeyman had to produce, and one was to see if his eye was keen to a thin to thick, and conversely thin to thick without any visible transition. And so I forged my reins just like that journeyman test. Now the next step we're going to do is we're going to go back to the bit, and there's 3 different tools that I'll be using. I'll be using a fuller to fuller the Super Groove. I'll be using a chisel to open it up to make it the new improved Super Groove. Of course, I showed you how to use that punch, how to sharpen the punch, and how to find a bullseye and the witness mark and walking the punch and that kind of thing. And so we use the punch on the eye for the rivet. We use the fuller to groove the inside of the bit, and we'll use the chisel to split 2 inches of the fullered area next to the eye and about 1/2 inch from the end at the other side. So now what I want to do, and we'll get into this later, what I want to do is let me bring your eye up to this handout, and these are the tools that I make, and these are the materials that I use for the specific tools. So I use the hot punch, and you can make the round hot punch, you can make it square, you can make it a slot punch, and that probably should be made out of a steel that holds its shape even when it's hot. And so I use the H13. H13 is available from steel suppliers. It should be less than $5 a pound. Maybe you can get it for $2.50 a pound. But that's why I make these small tools, because you can have a lot of money tied up. And again, don't heat this when you're forging this tool. Just heat this area, draw your shape, scrap tag them around, square, or your slot punch, which I would forge scrap tag around and then squash it to the punch so you get the radius edges. That should be made out of H13. If you're going to open steel up from the middle, we call it slitting. Slitting is opening up in the middle, not from the end. And it has a V shape so that it's very aerodynamic or fluid dynamic, and so that it pierces the material with the least amount of friction and effort, and the least amount of surface area to give you less than the amount of force that it's going to require to put in. And we'll talk more about how to sharpen these edges, but right now what I want to do, and that should be H13 as well, what I want to do now is I want to talk about the splitting chisel. And the splitting is done from the end. So that's how we distinguish the slit from the middle when you open up a bar, and then the split is from the end. And this is canoe shape. This George Dixon described this in his book and also in his demonstrations, and he was a blacksmith for Francis, working at the Yellow Museum for many years, and he shared a lot of the information, and one of these was this idea of this canoe shape. So this is looking at the end of the tool. This is the side of the tool. So if you were to cut that end off, you'd get this little canoe, and you can see it's pinched at the corners. It's wide in the middle, but it maintains the same angle. The same angle is up here. It's just narrow angle, wider and narrower. So I want to show you how I grind that, because we're going to need to use that splitting chisel for the end, but I'm also going to use the splitting chisel for the middle because it leaves a nice transitional shape. We'll use the slitting chisel for opening up eyes and tools and that kind of thing. I'm also going to be using a fuller, and a fuller should be shaped like a peen so that it's the diameter that you want, and then it crowns a little bit so that it doesn't bite in on the edges. If that fuller were straight across, when you use it, it would bite in on the edges. So we're going to be using a fuller and also a chisel for this next operation. So let's walk over here to the belt grinder. I'm going to show you how I grind. Be careful with this cord. Sometimes in a blacksmith shop, you just got to be, there's all kinds of hazards, tripping, burning, So I'm going to use the slack belt area of a belt grinder. You can use the contact wheel, which is a harder grind. You can put a larger wheel on it. You can use the platen, but I'm going to use the slack belt area. Slack belt area should be tight, but it should also give. And I use that quite a bit on when I'm grinding. So here's what I'm talking about when I'm talking the difference between the slitting chisel and the splitting chisel. Although this slitting chisel has lost its V shape, but I want to grind these tools. Now, this is not these tools are not the tools to end all tools, because even though you have a splitting chisel, you may have different angles to your splitting chisel. So for instance, on this chisel, you can see how it's narrow and how this one is actually wide. So if you were to transfer that edge would be like this. On this tool, the edge would be more like this. So if I use this to cut, it'll cut, but it'll create a more of a V shape. If I use this to cut, it'll cut, but it'll create a channel shape. So pay attention to how the end of your tools are. And what happens is, as you grind this tool back to sharpen it up, it'll get wider and wider. And in order to make that sharp, you'll have to raise the angle of your tool. And so naturally, it will create a chisel that has a wider angle. So that doesn't mean that it needs to be reforged. You can reserve that chisel for the times that you need a wide angle, but pay attention to that, because that's going to require more force to split. It's also going to create a more suck in, because it's going to drag that material down, and it's going to create visually a wider line. And that may be something decorative that you want. If you want a border on a scutcheon plate, you can use a splitting chisel that has a wide angle because you've grounded so far back. Now you're going to reserve this for a decorative border in a scutcheon plate. So it's not like it's bad, it's just that it's going to give you a different effect if you're not paying attention. So what I want to do is I'm going to show you, and I've got 3 monkey hands of death holding 3 different tools, and we've used the punch already, and I showed you how to sharpen the punch. The fuller will be the next tool that we use, and this fuller is pretty much ready to go. It's just like the drawing, where it's got a crown to it. It's pretty flat in here, and then it crowns back up. That way it doesn't make any harsh marks entering or exiting. So I can use this fuller both ways, by pushing it or by pulling it. And then this is a splitting chisel, but this splitting chisel actually has a very narrow blade, and that's the one I'm going to use to open up the both the new improved groove and also the end. But I want to show you how I grind them, because it's a very specific grind. So going back to George Dixon described that. He described what I'm describing for you, that you should have multiple chisels that have different angles, different widths. So you can see that these are, for the most part, the same chisel. The width and the grind, they're both sharp, except that this is narrow and that's wide. So that's going to create a faint line, and it's with a lot less force and with less suck in. That's going to create a broad line with a lot more force and quite a bit more suck in. So just be aware of that. If you want to turn this back into that, you're going to have to forge that blade out. These are both made out of H13. Again, this is 11/16 H13. I used 3/4 11/16. They were just heated on the end, and then you blank that out either by hand or with a power hammer. Don't get this hot. If you don't get it hot, it won't get hard. And you can see that the hammer blows are visually giving you a cue that these are absorbing the force, so that you don't want having any shrapnel that are coming off of a spalled end that's being forged. Try to make your tools about the same dimension, about 4 inches long. They may start off a little bit longer, so you have a little bit more life to them. They can get a little shorter, so that you can really, prolong the life of a tool. But you're really only looking at about 50 cents worth of metal when you forge these tools out of this material. So that's another bonus to using the monkey hands as your handle and forging small tools. It's just, you don't have very much money invested in it. So I'm gonna sharpen this chisel, and I'm gonna use the slack belt area. And I could use this slack belt area, or I could use this slack belt. This is quite a bit stiffer, so I'm gonna use this slack belt area because I want a lot of control. And to grind that canoe shape, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start low. So this is low, that's high. So I'm going to start off low on the corner. When I get to the middle, I'm going to bring it up, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to drop it again. And that gives me a transition almond shape that like a canoe moving through the water is sharp. It lays it open and it brings it back together. So whether I'm cutting one way or the other, I want to be able to depend on that thin edge to begin opening the metal up for that wider edge. But this is such a nuance, it's such a subtlety that I'll have to show you how this is ground. So I'm gonna grind it low, high, low. Flip it over, low, high, low. I'll check the sharpness by running my finger like here. If you can see the edge, it's not sharp. And I can see that edge. It's when that edge disappears, it's sharp. You can feel it with your finger and you can see it with your eye. So I'm gonna go low, high, low, low. So now the edge has disappeared. All we can see is the shiny facets, and I can feel that that's quite sharp. It's got a little burr on it, one side or the other, which you can strop off, but I typically don't worry about that. Now, if you really want this chisel to cut with the least amount of suck in, there's a primary bevel and a secondary bevel, and this is how you sharpen knives. You have a primary taper, and then you have a secondary taper. The primary taper is very narrow, and if I projected that off into space, it would get thinner and thinner until it became infinitesimally sharp and thin. But the problem with solely a primary bevel is that if you go to use it, you'll roll that edge. So that's why on blades they have a primary bevel and then they have a secondary bevel. That secondary bevel, it takes that primary and it makes it stronger. It reinforces that sharp edge with that secondary bevel. But the problem with that secondary bevel, if I can project that out, you can see that the secondary bevel are my fingers, and then the transition between the secondary and the primary are my knuckles. And those knuckles, they have drag. If you try to force that into hot steel, it's going to suck that metal in. So what you want to do is you want to relieve the transition between the primary and the secondary. So I'm going to knock that little edge off. Very subtle thing, but it makes a big difference as far as how well it cuts. So now I'm going to lower my angle and I'm going to knock this edge off on both sides. So I didn't mess with the blade. I just took that transition between the primary and the secondary bevel and just like square octagon around, I knocked that corner off, and now I've got basically, instead of a square, I've got an octagon. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides on those. So this is a much more efficient tool, but it still maintains the strength of the primary and the secondary bevel. Okay, so I'll use this tool after I use the fuller. But right now what I want to do is I'm going to take my fuller. My fuller is a real easy tool to forge. This is made out of sucker rod or 4140 or whatever you have. It's not heat treated. It's not hot work steel. So it's just a blunt edge. And I grind that like I grind the hammer. It's a half round. And you can play around with the shape of your fuller, but this is going to make the shape that I need for the inside of the monkey hands. But I want to knock that corrosion off. And if you have a polished hammer face and you work with a polished hammer, then your work is going to be polished. Remember, we were talking about hammer polishing, and your power hammer dies the same way. If your power hammer dies are polished, then you'll get a polished surface. If they're crusty and corroded, then you'll get that transmitted into your surface. That may be the texture that you want, but if you want a clean surface, you want a clean texture, then you want clean tools. So this can be ground, and then you can use Scotch-Brite. And this is a tool that I patched together a long time ago. And I have a Scotch-Brite wheel on it. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to just polish it with the Scotch Brite. Now when I work a tool like this, you want to get a nuisance mask or some kind of respirator, because that Scotch Brite is made out of nylon and abrasive, and it comes off, and when you're working for a long time, you can see it leaves a trail. Well, it's going to kick it up in the air, so it's something that you probably want to avoid breathing. All right, anytime that you see sparks or powder coming off, you just really want to avoid breathing that. If it's just going to be for a second, I just use my shirt as a respirator. It's not the best thing, but you know, I've got it. It's there. It'll protect me. I also hold my breath quite a bit. So when I'm working at tools that put off a lot of particulate, I'll hold my breath while I'm at that process. If it's just going to be for 30 seconds, I can hold my breath for 30 seconds. So just pay a lot of attention to what you're breathing in the blacksmith shop. Yeah, there's a lot of things that can harm you in that's seemingly innocuous, but over years of being in the shop, it'll take its toll. So this is a nice tool to start off with. It's not perfectly polished, but you know, it'll do. I'm looking at 90%. That's my goal. And anything above that may take me twice as much time, and half the people will be able to tell the difference. So I've got, you could do the math on that. So I'm looking for 90%, and that's going to give me a nice surface. If that were the outside and the final thing that I would see, I would maybe want to take any bit of the blemishes out. Okay. So we're back. I'm going to use the fuller that I just got through polishing to fuller my super groove, and then I'll use my chisel to improve that fuller groove. So I'll heat very carefully just the bit now. I'm done with the eye. I'm punched and I'm drifted, and now I'm going to heat just a bit. I'll have a little bit of reserve heat that bleeds into the top of that eye, but it's not going to affect it too much. It's only going to be there for like 2 heats. So get the forge going again. Let's see, so here's our chisel. I'll be making some videos on the ancillary stuff, like how to make a tong clip, how to forge square to octagon to round, how to forge a flat taper, octagonal taper, round taper. So there will be some remedial demos to talk about individual techniques. Following this, I just wanted to give you a splash of what they all look together and how to make a product using all of these different techniques. So my forge is at the heat. Be very careful about how far I put it in there. I know that I've got a hot spot at the bottom of my burner, and I'm going to use that where most people would say, oh, you have to wait until the forge gets hot. No, it's just like a torch. It's a torch inside of a box. So I'm going to use that as an advantage. Although I'm going to pull one out just a little bit so that one has a head start on the other, so that I can alternate them and I stay busy. Again, I forge 2 irons in the fire. 3 irons is too much. 4, I'll get lost. So I find 2 is a good pace. When I'm forging 1, the other one is heating, and vice versa. So it's a good efficiency. And always think about that with your fuel. Fuel varies. Propane varies with the price of gasoline. Right now, propane is low. Propane can be very expensive, and also depends on how you buy it. If you buy it in the individual tanks, it's going to cost about $3 a gallon. if you buy it in bulk, it can drop that by half. So it's not a bad idea to get as large of a tank as you can. Sometimes it's more convenient to run the small tanks, but if you can afford to get 100 gallons at a time, that's where your price break is. I have a tank that, actually this is pulling off of my 250 gallon tank, and that's where you get the price break, is with the volume. Okay? So now I'm going to put this one in, and I'm ready. So I'll go in with my fuller, and I put my fuller at a 45. It's just ergonomic for me. So when the hands come together, they meet at a 45. You can make them work at 90, but it's very comfortable working 45. So the tongs are going to be at 45, which means that this will be straight. And that's a nice advantage of using these tools. See where my heat is? It's not really hot, but it's hot enough to do this work. So I'll balance this here, and I'm going to get so I'm going to push this into the fuller, and I'm going to raise the filler. So that way it's easy to center it. I'm going to push it in and then raise it up and hit it and take a look at it. It looks pretty good. I can move it over, but that is just giving me a witness mark. Now I'm going to rock it in the groove. So you can see each one of those marks is the crown of the fuller, so I'm rocking it in the groove, and that way I have one continuous groove. And it gets fullered all the way back. So by rocking it in the groove, I hit, I rock it, I hit, I rock it. I don't hit on the rock. I hit only when I advance it. But the heel of the tool, whatever it's a chisel or a fuller, keeps it in the groove. Where the work gets done in the belly of the tool. So I rock it in the groove on the heel, and that gives me one continuous line. So I'm going to forge it to half the dimension. So here at the end, it's going to go down to 1/8 of an inch, because that's a quarter. Here up here, it's 3/8 of an inch. It's going to go down 3/16, and I fuller the entire thing. So just pay attention to make sure that that and that are, for the most part, the same size. Now what I'm looking at is I'm splitting the difference here and here. So that's what I'm looking at to make sure that this is in the middle. So that's all you got. That's your gauge. Got a little warmer than but I'm still in good shape. So I'm going to push it into my fuller and start rocking it in the groove. Now you'll know if you're off center, because this will either bend this way or it'll bend this way. If it bends this way, you're too far over here. If it bends this way, you're too far over here. So it's staying straight. And I'm going to go to half the heat, rocking in the groove. I'm going to go a little deeper. I want to bump the heat just a little bit more. I got my witness groove, my witness mark. In this case, it's a groove. I'm going to go half the dimension down. And go more as I go back. And I'm not looking at this. I'm looking at this. I may misstrike once or twice, but I'll make the correction next time. So you should be paying attention to the work, not the end of the tool. We're almost done with that. So I take multiple passes. Okay, so that's where that needs to be. That's half the dimension. This is bending a little bit this way. So if I work it a little bit here, it'll straighten it out. So watch this. It's going to straighten itself, because I'm going to work on this side. Now it's straight. It was curving this way. I worked a little bit over here. Now it's straightened it up. Now I'm going to go half the dimension. And you can literally planish with the fuller, so it takes all of those steps out. It won't matter because I'm going to chisel that anyway, but you can lightly planish now and take those marks out if that's important to you. And that makes it nice and smooth. Okay, now I'm done with the fuller. Now I go in with the chisel. And again, I'm working inside out. I'm going to let one get a head start. Now I'm going to put this on the floor or on the swage block. And again, the chisel is also set up at a 45. And if not, you can make it a 45. Or I can straighten it up. Or I can do the 45 on the other side, depending on if I'm going to do which cut. Lengthwise or perpendicular. But this is, now I'm ready to go. And I'm staggering those so that they don't. So I'm going to skip back a half of an inch. And I'm going to lightly give myself a witness mark. This is cut on the inside. So there's my witness mark. Skip back at least a half of an inch. I'm going to say that's more like 3/4 of an inch because I don't want this cut to get anywhere near where the cut is going to be on the other side. So 3/4 of an inch back, and I'm going to build that cut. This is with the canoe shape, and you'll see the results of the canoe shape because it's got a nice entrance taper and a nice exit taper. 3/4 of an inch back in the middle of your fuller. This first one is really a witness mark, so if it's not in the middle, it should fall in the middle anyway because it's falling into the bottom of the fuller. But if it's not, then you can walk it over. So put it in your groove, walk it over, and then do another one. But I'm happy with that. I'm gonna build it so I don't make the cut all at once. If you make the cut all at once, it'll rip the steel apart. You'll get a really rough cut. If you build the cut, it'll cut it apart. So again, you can see the transitional shape of the canoe where it's pinched and it gets wider in the middle. The forge is almost outrunning me. Now, I would say do most of your work on the anvil, because the anvil is going to give you a lot of support and it's not going to suck your heat out. But at some point in time, you don't want to damage the edge of the chisel against the anvil. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get ready with an aluminum plate. I think I got an aluminum plate here somewhere. And aluminum plate is going to give me support. Just sheared up plate that had a different purpose, so there's no really reason why that's got that. It's not really beneficial either, honestly. That'll work like that. So I'm going to suggest that at some point in time, start cutting over the plate, because if you make through on the anvil face, it's going to damage the chisel. I have to go deeper on the end in order, because of that canoe shape. I have to tilt it because it crowns up. So when I'm cutting this part and when I'm cutting this part, I'm going to be tilting the chisel a little bit like that. You can see if I had more than 2 irons in the fire, there's just no way I would be able to keep up. So 2 is my max. Now, when the H13 starts getting gummy, it's telling you to cool it. and it feels like it's dragging. When it's cold, it's a smooth cut. When it starts feeling like it's dragging, it needs to be cleared. Taking my time cutting through it. You can see my witness mark here. Basically it's the rose that's coming through, and I want to cut it, so I'm not really interested in doing a lot of work all at once. It needs to be. So now I'm cut and very little rag, and it's because hardly any of it was torn apart. Cut, very little rag. Okay, now I'm going to use the chisel. I'm going to finish cutting this, but I'm going to use the chisel itself as a drift. So I'm going to open it up here, and I'm going to hammer it against here. You see what that just did? It radiused that cut. It made that cut rounded. And then I'm going to drive it this way. So it radiuses that cut. You can also, if you don't have on the diagonal on a hardy haul, you can also do this in a leg vise with fairly open jaws. This also squares up your end. Sometimes one operation does two things at the same time. So there's my slot radiused, and I'm ready to make the next cut. So here's where we are. Now I'm going to make this cut. And this cut goes in from the top. That was on the inside. So the inside being where the tongs will, on the inside where they'll meet. The next cut is on the outside, and it just looks nicer when that cut is on the outside. Again, I'll stagger it in the fire, and I'm going to walk the chisel. That's warm. I'm going to walk the chisel towards the end. I'll use my finger, which is kind of barbaric, but I'll push my stock up to it, and then I'll walk it up. And I want to cut it with half the chisel on and half the chisel off. So basically I'm going to cut through it just like that. And I want the end to have, so this will be like just a witness mark, just to make sure I'm in the middle. So it's easy to find the middle when you push it up to the chisel. And that looks like a middle. Again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tilt the chisel back so I make that cut. I'm going to go a little bit deeper, but you can see the effect of the canoe shape. One more time, I'm going to push this in, make sure I'm in the middle, roll the chisel up, take a look at it, and if it's in the middle, great. If it's not, you can walk it out of the groove. It's not that deep right now that it's going to damage it, so you can see how I can walk it, but I'm going to go back in my groove. It looks good. The chisel half on and half off. I'll use the residual heat of the forge to heat the tips. Bump it a little bit. This will finish this half. So I just need to see some daylight in there. I'll go a little deeper with that cut at the vise. I'm going to go straight downward. And if you want, you can use the chisel itself to radius that groove so it doesn't set up hard shut. You do this with a very thin fuller too, but okay, so now you definitely see the daylight in that. Literally. Mm-hmm. And again, that forge is still handy. It still has heat, so you're paying for that heat. So I'm going to make the cut. And I'm going to say that cut is clear daylight, 1/2 inch. And I'm going to radius the cut with the chisel so that it relieves a bit of a shut. I may argue with that, but when you look at that cut, you'll see that it does radius the cut. Right in the crux of that cut is a slight radius. Okay, so that's where we'll stop for today. And we'll pick back up with the remaining part of these tongs. We'll be reaming the hole with the drill. And I want to show you how I completely destroy a drill bit and sharpen it. But we'll need to ream this to 3/8, and I'll forge a rivet. We'll set the rivet. One thing I forgot to say is we're going to swage this, but we'll swage this, set the rivet, and ease the tongs. Thank you for your time and your patience.